Brothers and sisters in the hope of Israel. Our title is taken from the Apocalypse chapter 19 and verse 7. Turn with me therefore, if you would. In our last two classes we've considered the respective responsibilities of both husbands and wives whilst being in marriage, and how they are mirrored in our relationships we have as the Master's bride. Tonight we aim to consider our preparation for both of these relationships. They are very similar, aren't they? Which I believe is quite deliberate, so that we can relate more to our eternal relationship based on our current experiences. But of course there are differences between the two. Apocalypse 19 and verse 6 speaks of the delightful time when multitudes of saints will sing for absolute joy, praising the Father at the commencement of a wonderful, righteous, just rule of the Father through his Son and his bride over the whole earth. For the wonderful deliverance and blessing that has been bestowed upon them. And they sing, verse 6, "Let us be glad and rejoice and give honour to him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife hath made herself ready." There is a time for everything, isn't there? But at long last there will be a time of unspeakable joy and rejoicing for those faithful who have prepared themselves as a faithful bride for their eternal marriage with the beloved. Turn with me to Romans 8 and verse 18 records, "For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." And so this will be a time that we look long and yearn for. But very importantly for us at present, in Apocalypse 19 and verse 6, the emphasis is on the bride who has made herself ready. And so it's something she has actively done. And as a consequence, Apocalypse 19 and verse 8, we see her blessed. For she is granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white. For the fine linen is the righteousness of saints. In other words, she has at long last been clothed with the wonderful privilege of spirit nature that her husband has. And she has now become mortal. What an unspeakable joy and a wonderful blessing that will be, brothers and sisters. Apocalypse 21 continues this theme, but refers to the age at the end of the millennium, when there will no longer be any sea or nations. Verse 1, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there were no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband." And so it speaks of the time when the Father will at last, long last, be all in all. In Christ, we similarly typically put on Christ, or as garments, as is implied by Galatians chapter 3 and verse 27. They are also white, similar to the Mosaic priestly garments, which as priests after the order of Melchizedek typify the imputed righteousness we are blessed with in baptism. And we either maintain or we soil them by the nature of our walk. Apocalypse 3 and verse 4, the words are well known to us, refers to a few names in Sardis which had not defiled their garments. "And they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy." Matthew 22, there is the parable of the king who made a marriage for his son. And in verse 11 we find one guest who is found not to have a wedding garment, and was consequently cast out into outer darkness. To my way of thinking, the guest wasn't either baptized, or if he had been, he'd so corrupted his garment that it was no longer considered a suitable wedding garment. Matthew 25 records the parable of the 10 virgins, 10 signifying all, and in its context it refers to all those who are called to be the bride of the Master. All were caught out sleeping at his return. But only 5 of them had been wise, having previously prepared oil for their lamps. Given the current signs of the times, surely we must be very near to the midnight of our Master's return, and surely it will be nice to be found with the true spirit of the word refined in our hearts and our minds, and for it to be shining in our lives, manifesting the character of the Father. Let us not be caught out. There are a limited number of scriptures which refer to wives preparing themselves for their marriage in Scripture. There's the lovely example of Ruth that we could go to. But let's turn to Esther and chapter 2 and verse 12, which refers to Esther's preparation for marriage with her husband. Esther 2 and verse 12. Now when every maid's turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purification, according to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odours, and with other things for the purifying of the women. And so a year is typical of a life cycle. And for half of that time she was preparing herself with the oil of myrrh. Oil speaks of the word, whilst myrrh means bitter, which reminds us of the word and its bitterness for those who have not lived in harmony with it. And we think particularly of the roll that was eaten in Apocalypse chapter 10 and verse 10, which was sweet to the mouth, but bitter to the belly. By tradition, the oil was used as a preparation for the softening of the skin. And so there's another allegory there, isn't there? It alludes to the softening of the things of the flesh, of our fleshly minds, to the spirit. And for the other half of Esther's life, she prepared herself with sweet odours, which alludes to the prayer which wafted up acceptably to the Father from off the golden altar, and in this context was to her groom. And traditionally it dispelled the odours of the flesh, and so how appropriate that is also, that we should absorb our minds in the spirit of the word and show our response to the Father in sweet, acceptable prayer. Similarly, we expect our prospective partners to prepare themselves for marriage and for all its implications, and in this context to demonstrate a similar interest and commitment to the truth, and as much as possible have similar interests in the things of this life. Last week we tried to stress that absorbing the word is vitally important for both of us, for both male and female. It's not something which is limited to just the brethren. And a sister ought to be equally spiritually minded. But how can we make that easier for ourselves, perhaps in this mad, rushed life of the world? Well, just quickly turn to Psalm chapter 1, if you would, Psalm 1. And there we are told that a spiritual man should be like a tree planted by the waters. Psalm 1, verse 1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of Yahweh, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. Keep a finger there and just turn with me to Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 7. Jeremiah 17 and verse 7. Blessed is the man that trusteth in Yahweh, and whose hope Yahweh is. For he shall be as a tree planted by the waters, and that spreadeth out his roots by the river, and shall not see when heat cometh, but her leaf shall be green, and shall not be careful in the year of drought, neither shall cease from yielding fruit. And so both we and our partners ought to be keeping ourselves spiritually healthy for the sake of one another, for the sake of our families and the ecclesia, by planting ourselves by a good source of water, the word, and by spreading our roots individually along the bank and into the riverbed, so that in a time of drought, in times of difficulty and trial, we can individually find that water and support one another. And we will only achieve this according to Psalm 1. If we delight and if we meditate in the law of the word of the Father. And Jeremiah 17 then adds that we will only be blessed if we place our trust and our hope in the Father. Turn with me to Romans chapter 8 and verse 11. Paul there makes it quite clear how vital the development of the spirit mind is for us. Romans 8 and verse 11. But if the spirit of him that raised up Jesus from the dead dwell in you, he that raised up Christ from the dead shall also quicken your mortal bodies. Notice, by his spirit that dwelleth in you. So we can only be quickened, made immortal, by the Spirit of Christ that dwells in us. And if it is not there, then surely it won't be possible, according to Paul, to quicken us. Turn over to Romans chapter 12 whilst we're there as well. Chapter 12 verse 2. We looked at this last week. And be not conformed to this, Romans 12 verse 2, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. And transformed has the root idea of metamorphosis, which is a complete change from one thing to another, like the changing of a grub to the beautiful butterfly, no longer having anything of the old body left. But notice it was a process Paul expects us to put into place. And the process commences with our minds, involving, God willing, ultimately our bodies. And so, how might we be renewed? 1 Peter 1 and verse 13 says, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind. In other words, so that we can run. And verse 14 says, as obedient children, not fashioning or conforming yourselves according to the former lusts in your ignorance. And Acts chapter 17 and verse 11 explains that the Thessalonians received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily whether these things were so. And so the reading and the discussing of the scriptures together, the coming together in heart and mind on the same precepts and principles, the same understanding, both in the word and in our daily lives, is vital for establishing a strong, close bond of hearts and minds with one another. But once the renewing of our minds has begun to deepen, turn with me to Isaiah chapter 50. Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 4. Speaking of the Master, it implies it ought to develop an understanding or an awareness within us. Isaiah 50 and verse 4. An ability to perceive the needs of one another and to naturally help them as best we are able. Verse 4. The Lord Yahweh hath given me the tongue of the learned. Why? That I should know how to speak a word in season to him that is weary. And to that end he was wakened morning by morning. He wakeneth mine ear to hear as the learned. How important it is to notice the weary in the first place, and then to speak the word in season for them, to encourage them, to lift their spirits and help refocus someone who is feeling low. Yes, perhaps occasionally the word of correction is appropriate, but in the spirit of meekness, helping one another to grow spiritually and morally. And of course, perhaps it doesn't need saying, but we do that without self-justification, without self-importance, pride, or for selfish reasons. And James, for a very good reason, in James chapter 1 and verse 27 says, true or pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. And he uses that as his example because it is acknowledged to be the worst tragedy or difficulty anyone has to cope with in life. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 8 reminds us that the Master learned by the things which he suffered. And so by his experience of life at the hands of the serpent thinking, he learned that living selflessly, righteously, mercifully, peaceably, in everything that he was the only way in which anyone can live harmoniously with anyone else together. And with the Father in glory and in beauty. And similarly, if we build our relationships, our thinking, and the things that we do on the pure values of the truth, then won't an appropriate prospective partner see them, respect and appreciate them in you? But how quickly that respect and the love can fail if we become untrustworthy, hold back, not being open, not being totally honest, misbehaving, speaking inadvertently, being manipulative. How quickly that relationship will begin to falter. And so it would be inappropriate, when you think about it, for that marriage to go ahead. Paul suggests in 1 Corinthians 13, I'm not going to go there in verse 13, I'm sure you recollect it, that love is the most important characteristic to have. And importantly, 1 John 4 and verse 16 adds that the Father is love. And if we have the same love, then he dwells in us and we in God. What a lovely thing that is. True fellowship, one with the other. And surely if the Master sees that love in us at his return, why would it occur to him to turn us away? Because we will have become part of him and of his Son. And similarly, we see the same love. If we see the same love in our prospective relationships, why would we turn our partners away? And so, similarly, there would be fewer problems in our marriages. Love, it seems to me, is another way of describing the fruit of the Spirit. And it is the all-encompassing description of the Father as the name Yahweh is. And manifesting the fruits of the Spirit is therefore essential in everything that we do. And it's expressed in many ways, but the main ones are recorded in Exodus chapter 34 and verse 5. Merciful, gracious, long-suffering, and abundant in goodness and truth, forgiving iniquity and transgression. And then there's 1 Corinthians 13. There's 2 Peter 1. But turn with me, if you would, to Galatians chapter 5. And we'll quickly look at it from that perspective. Galatians 5 and verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. And it seems to me that there is actually just one fruit of the Spirit, that is love, which is in turn composed of 8 different qualities. And so joy is often joy, when you look through how it's used, is expressed in abnormally adverse circumstances, which is only possible when we consider things from the spirit-mind's point of view and not the flesh's. Again, how much that can help, not just in the truth, but in our personal relationships. Not ignoring the issues, but having accepted them, address them as best we can, and then move on positively. Similarly, understanding that the Father does put us through difficult situations to teach us, develop our characteristics, as we saw with the Master, for roles that he has in mind for us. And that joy can help us to respond, knowing often, but not always. Sorry, I'm trying to say that it's not the end issue, usually, that we're stressing about. That's the important thing. It's the difficulty, the way we deal with that difficulty, which matters in the main, and the way that we respond to it. Anyway, peace is a deep-rooted peace based on an absolute conviction of the truth, having a deep, calm knowledge that the Father is working with us for good, knowing that he will bless us ultimately in the millennium with the peace that passeth all comprehension, establishing the same deep-rooted love and trust in one another is also a huge aid and blessing in our marriages. Long-suffering speaks of a long patience, slow to anger. And parents know that's very advantageous, which shows an endurance or a perseverance. Gentleness is kindness. It speaks of a pleasantness, to be pleasing as opposed to being harsh or grumpy, as we would say perhaps today. Goodness speaks of uprightness, of honourableness, and the disposition to do good and looking after others. Meekness speaks of someone who holds back, who isn't weak but is strong and controls their strength. Temperance speaks of self-control, someone who controls his desires, his passions, we would say his emotions scripturally. They are all, of course, qualities that help to make a good relationship in both our marriages. Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 11, if you would. There's something there which strikes me, and I know I've said this before, but it's something that's really hit home hard to me over the last few years. You see, and I'm sure like yourselves, you do not like being hurt twice. I'd rather learn the lesson the first time. Now, Hebrews 12 and verse 11. Now, no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness. But there's a condition. Unto them which are exercised thereby. And we understand that trials in one form or another, every minute of the day, are deliberately brought upon us to develop our characteristics, to help us practice manifesting the peaceable fruits of righteousness in everything that we do. But there is a very big proviso, and that is if we are exercised by the trial, then the fruits will come. So what does it mean to be exercised by them? Well, surely we have a choice in any situation to respond as the flesh would, selfishly, or as the Father would like us to. One or the other. And it seems to me that we are exercised by our trials when we ponder them, when we consider how the Father would like us to respond. And so over time we develop good habits that show we keep his commandments and demonstrate his love, the principles and the precepts of the truth, and that we have truly become his children who are fit for his use and purpose in the millennium. And how appropriate the close relationship of marriage is for practicing all the fruits of the Spirit on a daily basis. Our current lives then are a temporary daily training ground to practice under trial, developing the fruit of the Spirit that we might become vessels fit for the purpose he has with us in the millennium. One of the greatest and moving examples of a bride preparing themselves for marriage, to my way of thinking, is recorded in the Song of Solomon. If you would turn there with me. The love between the groom and his prospective bride is so evident all the way through it. There's a desperate desire to see and be with one another. And the way the love motivates them is so apparent, which of course ought to be the same for us. But turn to our reading, chapter 4, which records, to my way of thinking, the first time when they at long last get to sit together quietly after the hustle and bustle of their marriage, and the groom looks into his bride's eyes and says, verse 1, "Behold, thou art beautiful, my love. Thou art beautiful." And I like to think they sit on the top of Mount Hermon, which is referred to in verse 8. It's the highest mountain in the land, some 9,000 feet high, from which on a clear day they would be able to see a vast expanse of the land. Verse 8, "Come with me from Lebanon, my spouse, with me from Lebanon. Look from the top of Amana, from the top of Shinar and Hermon." It's all the one mountain range. And together as newlyweds they express their love for one another. Hand in hand, "Thou art beautiful, my love. Thou art beautiful." And they sit together and survey their joint inheritance, the gloriously restored land of promise made to the great fathers of old. How lovely, brothers and sisters. And what lovely comments the Master expresses about his bride. There are 7 in total in these first 5 verses. And he comments on her eyes, on her hair, her teeth, her lips, her temples, her neck and her breasts. Verse 1, "Thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks." The eyes speak of the light, the understanding, the discernment, the perception of the mind. And the dove is a symbol of the Spirit. We think of John 1, verse 32, of purity, gentleness, of harmlessness. The locks are thought to refer to a veil, which speaks of submission, of course, and modesty. And so the Master appreciates the clarity, the discernment of a spiritual insight, mixed with a gentle understanding modesty. How different is that from the thinking of the world, their values, and the way they use their spare time, glued in front of a television, being indoctrinated by their thinking and their values. Verse 1 continues, "Thy hair is as a flock of female goats that appear from Mount Gilead." Hair speaks of a beauty, a glory. The hair of a woman is the glory of the man. And isn't there a multitudinous unity of all the hairs on the head? Gilead speaks of fruitfulness and health. Verse 2, my teeth are like a flock of thy teeth, are like a flock of sheep that are even shorn, which come up from the washing. There's no direct reference to sheep in the original. Young's literal says, thy teeth are as a row of the shorn ones that have come up from the washing. For all of them are formed twins, and a bereaved one is not among them. Well, good teeth are a beauty, aren't they? They show our health. They reflect the things we eat, a wise diet, our spiritual food. Shorn means regularly formed. They are washed clean in the blood of the Lamb, in his life, in the word and works. They are twinned. In other words, they are closely coupled together, and there are none missing. The beauty of the bride is in the balanced evenness of her eating of the word, and of the balanced result of her character and conduct. And so we wonder, how rare is balance? How rare is intense zeal without hypocriticism? Or gentle kindness without a weakness or a compromise? She sees the world situation realistically, her brothers and sisters, their strengths and weaknesses, and strives to support and care as best she can. How important balance is to the bride's beauty in the eyes of her groom. Verse 3, my lips are like a thread of scarlet. Thy speech is comely. The lip or the mouth is like a sewing of scarlet, where scarlet isn't necessarily depicting sin, but sometimes the sinless cleansing blood of the life of the Master. Verse 3 continues, thy speech is comely or beautiful. The beautiful speech of the bride gives forth only the law of kindness. For she is the virtuous woman, the ideal wife. But the beautiful bride's speech is comely, both in content and in manner. For she knows that, as Proverbs 25 and verse 11 records, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. And she also knows that every idle word will be called to account at the last great day, as the Master warns in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 36. Verse 3 continues, thy temples are like a piece of pomegranate within thy locks, or the veil. The temple is the seat of thought, of judgment and character, the thinking. The forehead is where the sealing of God's servants must occur, the stamping of it with the indelible impression of what is pure, holy and divine. A pomegranate is a special fruit, isn't it? When you cut it open, it's so full of individual seeds. And so it speaks of the so many fruits of the Spirit that the mind of the bride exhibits. Verse 4. Thy neck is like the Tower of David, builded for an armoury. The neck connects the head to the body, therefore above all things it must be firm and strong like the Tower of David. The word for armoury appears to mean tall and slender. Verse 4 says, whereon they hang 1,000 bucklers or shields of mighty men. It was customary to hang rows of brilliant polished shields, the trophies of war, on the central defence tower of a city, which from a distance they would appear as chains of gold about a neck. And so the instruments of warfare of the mighty individuals in the troop, the sword of the Spirit, would be hung about her neck and shoulders. And so underneath, the bride would be resourceful and a strong character, not swayed by any wind of doctrine that comes her way. Verse 5. Thy two breasts are like two young roes. They are twins that feed among the lilies. The breasts represent motherhood, don't they? Sustenance and fruitfulness, the nurture and care of the young and the helpless. Lilies are the temple flowers, the divine flowers. Lilies appear to have been purple. And the name Shoshan, having a trumpet flower with a root meaning of shining or to rejoice. The roe is often translated glory or beauty, and is said to have speed and grace with sure-footedness in high places. Roes are not warlike animals, are they? They are clean and peaceful animals, warring to establish righteousness perhaps, and true permanent peace. So what lovely characteristics these are of a bride, things that the Master will love to see in his bride. And sadly for some, he will not see them, and it will not therefore be reasonable to expect him to want us as his bride. But stepping back a little bit and reflecting on these verses, it's very clear, isn't it, that the Master is being completely open. He's totally honest with her. And importantly, he does explain his feelings for her. And in so doing, isn't she assured about the depth of their relationship? How he appreciates her and why? And what a deep respect and appreciation surely that will cultivate in her mind for him. And by understanding one another's feelings, they can be much more considerate of one another. That doesn't directly criticise her either. He is positive, even though he is aware of her limitations, which he would be slow to point out, unless it's an immediate problem. It's also clear that he is the head in the relationship, and that she is in subjection, while both respect one another's roles in love. Where's the repression in these words? Where's the assertiveness? They are totally at ease one with the other. They love one another. And aren't they so close, longing for the company of one another, as is evident elsewhere in many of the songs? Chapter 2 and verse 14 says, she is sick of love. It's not an empty relationship based on just physical attraction. But they are clearly the best and closest of companions, with the same lifelong objectives. Their relationship and love has also endured separateness, difficulties, as is expressed in chapter 2 and verse 15, for foxes are referred to. And the relationship has survived. It is strong. Yes, there is a physical attraction in our relationships, but our relationships should be much, much more than that. Natural beauty does age. It may not appear to when you're young. It can be severely damaged by illness or accident. And if that was to be the case, sadly, the day after your wedding, how would you feel? Would you regret the marriage? Or have you chosen the right person? It's the person, the personality and the character of the person, which is so much more important. When we think of the Master's words in Song of Solomon chapter 4, doesn't the Master come across as being totally dependable? Isn't he easy to respect? He's noticed faithfully the things that she has been careful to try and develop in her preparation for him, knowing that they were important to him, but they were also things which were important to her, because she knew by experience that they were holy, just and true. And so how much easier is it for her to respect and honour him as a faithful, understanding, loving and dependable husband who has similar values and who has led her by example. Turn with me to 1 Peter 3 and verse 5. 1 Peter 3 and verse 5. There Peter says, for after this manner, in the old time, the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their husbands. Verse 6, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. Oh, I think those words are so strong and powerful. And they are the counterpart to those words that we've considered regarding husbands. Love your wives, even as the Master did give his life for his bride. Literally. But the inference of Peter's words to the wives here is that if they don't respect their husbands in the same way as Sarah, they will not be considered daughters of Sarah and will not, by implication, share in the blessings of her husband. Let's for a few moments turn to Proverbs chapter 31. I was going to read it, but since we read it at the weekend, let's just make a few points there. Verse 10. Proverbs 31, verse 10. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. Indeed, we are very well blessed if we find such a wife. And I think it's worth pondering that is how the Master thinks of his bride. There is genuine love for her, and he considers her as rubies. She has prepared herself so that she can be, verse 11, trusted, do him good. Verse 13, worketh willingly. So we see she uses her husband's resources faithfully. Verse 14, she provides exotic food from far. Verse 13, she arises while it's still night to provide food for her household. Verse 16, she buys a field to plant a vineyard. Verse 20, she provides for the poor and needy. Verse 22 and verse 24, fine clothing. Verse 26, she opens her mouth with wisdom, and her tongue is in the law of kindness. Verse 27, she's not idle. What wonderful words to describe your wife, and said in conclusion of her. Verse 29, many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. What lovely words of support they are from him to her, from a husband. Verse 30, favour is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth Yahweh, she shall be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates of judgment. At the judgment seat you might perceive. So in conclusion of our series, let's both, brothers and sisters, respect the order the Father has placed on us. Let us respect the equal capacity that we both have of understanding divine things, for us all to develop spirit minds for the benefit of ourselves, our partners, our families, of one another in the ecclesia. And we know that we are different, and thankfully so. But let's appreciate, understand and respect one another's roles, our different abilities, our capabilities, and learn to help one another in them as the Father wants us to, for his glory. Whilst a sister and wives are required to submit to all brethren, their husbands, all brethren and sisters ought to respect their wives as the weaker vessel, forgiving and accommodating them in love. But very importantly, they are then required to also give their lives, hopefully not literally, but some have been required to, but in their life's commitment to their spiritual and physical provision for his wife, caring and supporting them, just as the Master does and will do when he finally makes his commitment to us at the judgment seat. But brothers and sisters, let's not deceive ourselves in these things. It doesn't help if we set the target low. It doesn't help if we ignore these things. The Master understands whether his bride is selfless. and has a genuine love for him, and whether she is selfishly looking for what she wants to get from the relationship, such as salvation, eternal life, self-grandisement, status as kings and priests, just as Eve did in the garden. The master will know whether she is purely motivated by her selfless love for him, and whether she has genuinely prepared herself for him in love. And if not, I don't believe for a minute he will love us, and he will turn us away just as we would our prospective wives who are marrying for our money and for other motives. So in the days that remain to us, may we prepare ourselves for our earthly marriages, that our relationships be sure and firm based on the truth, that they are not weak, and be blessed in them in the mercy of the Father. And let us all wisely prepare for our eternal marriage with the Master, and be so privileged to hear those lovely, compassionate words of comfort from our husband, our faithful beloved, that we long and look forward to. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord.